7 weeks ago, when Julian Assange of WikiLeaks was dragged out of that embassy in London, headed for possible extradition to the United States, the site's editor, Kristinn Hrafnsson, told us the legal charges waiting for him in the U.S. were just the tip of the iceberg, that there would be more coming. And last week, he was proven correct. U.S. prosecutors have expanded the indictment against Assange by another 17 counts. His maximum jail term has jumped from 5 years to 175 years. And the U.S. Department of Justice is going after him under a different law now, the Espionage Act. That law has been used against whistleblowers before, WikiLeaks source Chelsea Manning included, but never against a publisher. The alarm bells, including from mainstream media organizations that fear the precedent such a prosecution would set, have been going off ever since. The Assange case isn't really about him or WikiLeaks anymore. It has implications, serious ones, for journalists just about everywhere. Our starting point this week is Washington, D.C. This indictment, all 37 pages and 18 charges in it, is the U.S. Department of Justice putting its cards on the table, laying out its hand. Should Julian Assange, founder of WikiLeaks, having been expelled from the Ecuadorian embassy in London, be extradited to the United States, then he will be tried under the Espionage Act. It is ironic that the charges also serve as a different kind of indictment.
Is he a criminal or is he a journalist?
Of all those journalists and news outlets, all the alleged experts and legal analysts who initially argued that the case against Assange was his to fight alone.
So you really think we, and I'll say we, I'm a journalist, you think we have it wrong and that he is actually not a pariah. We should be praising him and
that there were no implications for more conventional news organizations, because the real indictment provides prima facie evidence to the contrary.
For about 5 decades, it's been well understood since the Pentagon Papers case that the U.S. Constitution, and specifically the First Amendment to the Constitution, protects the receipt and publication of government secrets. And this is the first time the government has brought a charge under the 1917 World War I era Espionage Act, which is supposed to cover spying, not disclosing information to journalists. It's the first time that the government has brought charges under the Espionage Act based exclusively on the receipt and publication of government secrets.
This would foreclose and, in fact, obstruct all kinds of journalism throughout the United States and from other countries in the world. There is no legally meaningful difference between the work that WikiLeaks engaged in and the work that the New York Times or the Washington Post engaged in. And in fact, we know this to be true because President Barack Obama's administration declined to pursue a prosecution against WikiLeaks back in 2013. They were faced with something called the New York Times problem, which was if they prosecuted WikiLeaks, then they would essentially be saying that they had the authority to pursue and prosecute a reporter or a news editor at the New York Times.
When the Department of Justice announced the indictment, it held a closed-door briefing for reporters, on the record but off camera. The head of the department's National Security Division was widely quoted on Julian Assange's journalistic credentials. The department takes seriously the role of journalists in our democracy, he said. It is not, and never has been, the department's policy to target them for reporting. But Julian Assange is no journalist.
The question about whether Julian Assange is a journalist or not is irrelevant. The First Amendment does not bestow upon journalists a certain set of rights. They bestow everybody those rights, whether they call themselves a journalist or not. Luckily, we live in a country where the government does not license journalists. I think everyone can agree that Donald Trump shouldn't be the one deciding who is a journalist and who isn't.
The DOJ has highlighted a narrow set of facts that distinguish Julian Assange and WikiLeaks from traditional responsible journalists. Those include the alleged agreement to crack a government password and the irresponsible publication of the names of human sources. Neither of those things are activities that journalists would typically engage in. However, the indictment includes charges that relate to the solicitation, the receipt, and the publication of classified information. And those are things that good national security reporters do every day.
The use of the Espionage Act by the Department of Justice galvanized media outlets alarmed at the implications, not for Julian Assange, for themselves. The Washington Post called the case a blueprint for making journalists into felons. The New York Times' editorial board said the indictment aims at the heart of the First Amendment. And The Guardian's former editor called the charges a grave threat to free media. All that pushback felt like too little, too late. Julian Assange has been treated like a pariah by those same news outlets. Take the New York Times. In 2010, the Times, the UK's Guardian, and Germany's Der Spiegel all collaborated with WikiLeaks, resulting in the publication of the Iraq war logs. It was big news, but on day 2 of that story, the Times ran a lengthy profile piece on Assange, describing him as imperious, dictatorial, saying he was given to delusional grandeur. It was an odd way to treat a collaborator on one of the paper's biggest stories in decades. And when Assange later sought refuge in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, saying he feared for his freedom, the Times, as well as The Guardian, failed in their editorials to come to his defense. The sexual assault allegations in Sweden may have affected their thinking, but anyone familiar with that case and the numerous irregularities in the prosecution's handling of it would have to be suspicious of the motives at play. And even now, with all the Assange indictments out there, those news outlets are clearly more concerned with the possible legal precedents affecting them than they are about the fate of their one-time source.
The news media organizations that have reacted to this with alarm have done so with a full appreciation of the signal that this indictment sends to the press. You can be critical of Julian Assange. There may be many good reasons to take issue with the way that Assange has conducted himself and the way that WikiLeaks has released information to the public. But the charges brought against him in this indictment sweep much more broadly into the realm of typical journalistic practice.
If media organizations could do it all over again, I would suggest that they go back to 2010 when the grand jury was first impaneled against WikiLeaks, and they speak out loudly against the Obama administration pursuing this dissident media organization.
Of the substantial leak of documents
because what was happening back then was laying the groundwork for investigations that could target more traditional media organizations, whether they were based in the United States or outside of the United States.
The rise of WikiLeaks is attributable not only to the advent of technology, but also to changes in U.S. government policy. Since the 9/11 attacks in 2001, the American defense and intelligence establishments have gone on a classification binge in the name of national security. More and more material, field reports, assessments, interagency communications, the kind that used to be available to the public, have now been classified. An organization like WikiLeaks, that makes no secret that it's in the business of stealing secrets, has plenty to work with. And there's a market out there, millions of clicks to be had, that news outlets are well aware of, and the American authorities are too.
What they are essentially trying to do here is change that dynamic. They're saying we're going to prosecute Julian Assange for publishing classified secrets, but we may not stop there. That our court systems have this precedent that then can be used against other news organizations. And this is why many people are saying that this is really just a stalking horse for the Trump administration to go after other journalists.
And without the receipt and publication of classified information, without the free flow of that information to the public, many of the most important national security stories of the past 5 decades, including the Pentagon Papers, but also including torture post 9/11, mass surveillance after 9/11, all of these stories could not have been written without legal protections for reporters accessing classified information and occasionally publishing it.